Hey everybody, how you doing? And welcome to the John Riley Project. Happy Friday to y'all. This is episode number 240, a podcast all about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And thanks for joining me. Got a kind of a introspective podcast episode for you here today. We're going to talk a little bit about origin stories and why origin stories are really powerful. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my origin story, and I want to tell you a little the backstory about the logo for my podcast because I think it's a pretty cool story and I want to share that with you. So, we're live streaming on YouTube and on Facebook like we always do, pretty much every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 2 o'clock. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to type them in to the message area, the comment section on Facebook or YouTube. I'll see them on my screen right here. I'll read them on the air, and we'll have some fun, have a little conversation. Um, but yeah, so it's funny. I got a phone call earlier this morning from one of my previous guests, Charlie Sellers, former member of the Poway Unified School Board, and he had an extra ticket to the Padre game tonight. So I'm going with him. I'm looking forward to that. I haven't seen him in quite a while. So we're going to go to the Petco Park tonight and have some fun. But I do want to let's get into this. Yeah, and I want to really start with this story of the logo because this is something I wanted to share a long time ago, and I just it's a very personal story, and I thought today is a great day to share. Why not? Because it's important for me and my podcast, to kind of connect with the audience, get a chance to relate to you, and then frankly, one of the other podcasters that I know and respect, this guy named Jason Stapleton, he always says, make the podcast about yourself. And I try to do that quite a bit. So let's talk a little bit about my logo. If you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, you can see it. It's right over my right shoulder. I've got a big sign behind me. But if you're listening on iTunes or on Stitcher, you can see the avatar of it. It's the light bulb, right? And that's what I really want to break down for you and why this is cool. So when I decided that I started this podcast, it was like in August of 2018. And I just kind of made a temporary logo just to kind of get rolling because you kind of need a logo for your podcast, so it can be set up properly within Apple, iTunes, and everything else. But I always knew that if I wanted to do it and do it right, I wanted to hire a legit graphic designer to really help me do it really, really well. And so my daughter at the time was a student at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and she had a really good friend who was a fellow student and who was a graphic designer. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. I can, essentially help out one of my daughter's friends, pay her to do this project, and then I can get like kind of a nice, fresh look at my little podcast and get some thoughts and ideas on a logo. And we went back and forth, and she was wonderful. And she shared sketches and ideas. And it's just a lot of fun going through that process of creating your logo. Now, I will say this as a kind of a word of caution. If you're an entrepreneur and you're building your business, don't spend too much time on your logo. Spend time on generating income, getting new customers, building your business. Sometimes entrepreneurs can obsess over the logo, but I knew that I wasn't creating it myself. I farmed that out. I would periodically get updates from her, these sketches, these ideas. I'd zing back a few comments. And we had this conversation, and I was trying to explain to her what this podcast was all about. And I'd like to talk about how this is about big ideas, right? Big ideas about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we didn't really want to do it too much with life, liberty, pursuit of happiness because that kind of invokes a lot of Americana, and I didn't want to make it too, you know, nationalistic or patriotic. So we really embraced this big ideas angle, and that's how we came up with the light bulb. So the light bulb served us well, and she had created um, a number of different sketches of light bulbs, and I love the whole idea. Like I'm a big fan of logos that have an icon, and the icon, if it's done well, it can exist by itself without the words of the company. That's why I love the Nike swoosh. I'm a big fan of the Apple logo of, the apple with the bite taken out of it. In my opinion, a really good logo always has an icon. And if done well, that icon can exist standalone. And so she had created this light bulb icon for me, and we'd gone through a few iterations of it. And we eventually did the one that you see over my shoulder. And what she had done, what was very clever, that she used my two initials, J and R, as the filament in the light bulb. And that in and of itself is kind of cool. But what was really special, and what she did unbeknownst to herself, is that she made the R lowercase, capital J lower R in cursive as the filament for the light bulb. And artistically, that looks more appropriate, right? But little did she know how this was going to impact me personally, because this was, once I saw this, I was very moved, and it made a big deal. It was very important to me, because the capital J lowercase r is like junior, right? Like Fernando Tatis Jr. Well, if I'm gonna get into a little bit of my origin story, but a big part of my personal history is that my father was killed before I was born. And so with my name, you would think that I would be John Riley Jr. because my father's name was John Riley. So when my mother tried to file the official birth certificate, they told her that the father needs to be alive in order for the child to be a junior. And that sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? And I remember I looked it up some time ago, and that's a legit rule. Now, I can't remember if it was a legal rule or just sort of a custom, but if the father is not alive at the time that the child is born, then the child is essentially not eligible to be a junior. So here I was as a young child, had the same name as my father, whom I never met, but I wasn't a junior. And so that always kind of felt weird. But then when my daughter's friend, Elena, when she made the logo, she put the junior right into the filament of the logo. And that moved me. I was like, hey, now I can finally be a junior. It's baked into the logo of not only the uh, baked into the logo of my initials, but it's also baked into the logo of the John Riley project, which, this project of mine is more than just the podcast. It involves a lot of other things. It involves really a lot of blogging and entrepreneurism and a lot of personal self-discovery. And I share some of that here in this podcast episode. So when I saw that she had done the capital J lowercase r, I mean, she stumbled across it artistically. She didn't know my personal history. But man, when I saw that, I was like, oh, this is perfect. And so that's the reason that that's my logo. And so I know that I need to do more with it. One of the things I want to create, and I'm selling these on my website at johnrileyproject.com, is a hat with the light bulb logo on the very front of it. And so I still haven't ordered one of those for myself. You think I would, but that's one of the things I need to do. But at any rate, I wanted to share that with you, because sometimes it's cool when a logo has a deep personal connection to you as a business owner. And it also provides sort of a jumping off point to tell a story and to explain why that logo means what it does. And if you're successful, it's the logo will have multiple meanings, just like writing a song has multiple meanings depending on the listener. In this case, the light bulb, big ideas, the initials JR for John Riley, but the junior aspect to it was just kind of a neat thing. So I just thought that was worth sharing. Kind of a fun thing to do on a Friday. But this kind of leads me into this whole topic of origin stories. And what is an origin story, right? It's kind of like everyone has a backstory, right? Everyone has a story about how we grew up. And in those stories, you'll hear about, a young person overcame the odds, overcame obstacles in their life, only to be a success, and they are the new hero. And in all of our backstories and our origin stories, and for many of us, we are our own hero in our own movie about ourselves, right? At least I like to think of it in those terms when I'm alone and kind of reflecting on my life. But a lot of, legitimately, a lot of very famous people have origin stories, right? I mean, you can talk about Barack Obama and how he was born to a mixed race family and uh, lived in Indonesia at a time, and then was raised in Hawaii by a single mom, and then eventually by his grandparents in the United States. We hear, the origin story of President Joe Biden, working class family from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He likes to bring that up. And then later on in his life, a part of his origin story was, he was one of the youngest people ever elected to the Senate. I think he was a senator in his late 20s. And then he suffered a tragic, um, a tragedy where his wife and I think one or two of his children were killed in an auto accident. And then he was living in Delaware and wasn't, wealthy like a lot of the other senators. He would take the train back and forth to DC. So Joe Biden, his backstory has always been that everyday guy, that working class guy who in his own way overcame his own obstacles, his own hurdles, and now he's president of the United States. So you could say that he is a hero in his own way. Um, even for other characters, like we could look at Star Wars. I mean, look at Anakin Skywalker, right? Really the hero or the main character of Star Wars is arguably Darth Vader, right? Well, look at Anakin Skywalker. He was born a slave, born to a single mother, but at the time they were always searching for the chosen one. And this has a lot of Christian overlays to the story. And the what was it? Uh, um, yeah, it was. Huh, why am I spacing out on some of the characters? Obi-Wan Kenobi, and and was it Qui-Gon? The two of them, they had needed parts. Remember on Tatooine, and they ended up stumbling across the young Anakin and discovered that he had these powers and that he could very much be the chosen one. So he was able to be rescued or purchased out of slavery. And again, he was born not only as a slave but to a single mom. Do we even know who the father of Anakin Skywalker is? I don't think we do. And then he went on to be a hero and then eventually a villain and then came back to be a hero in the end, right? So eh, every famous person usually has an origin story. A lot of times, origin stories can be really effective stories to tell in your personal life, in business life, to give people a deeper insight to what makes that person tick, to understand what their values are, their moral code is. A lot of it is kind of baked in during their early years. And that's how they shape a lot of their values, their morals, and ultimately what is important to them. And the challenges that they've overcome often have ways of being reflected in their adult life, and they often are fighting similar battles as an adult. So I hope we all have our own origin stories, even you personally. Maybe you don't share it much, but I would hope that you have an origin story too. And I just kind of want to share my own. And without going into too much detail, but for me, and it's kind of like I talked about with the logo, right? With the JR, the junior bit of it. I mean, a big part of my origin story is that when I was born, my father didn't wasn't alive. My father was killed when my mom was pregnant with me, which was just, I mean, I think about it from the perspective of my mother being pregnant, um, being married for like about a half a year, being pregnant, and then having her husband killed. Just horrible. Um, but I was born into, essentially a single parent household. And then eventually my grandmother and my aunt lived with us. And that's kind of how I was raised. But I was always kind of the kid without a father. Um, I remember I was in the first grade and one of my classmates was really involved in why Indian guides. It's kind of like Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, and it's a father son thing. And my friend told his father about me, and his father brought me along. because he kind of sat in as my father, which is kind of cool. But I was always kind of the kid without a father. And then eventually my mother remarried, and um and during that process, there was just a lot of kind of chaos in my childhood, especially as I was into middle school and high school. So there was, my mother, when she remarried, to my stepfather. My stepfather had children from previous marriages, and they kind of lived with us, moved out. It was sort of a little bit of a revolving door at my house. There was, without going into too much detail, just a lot of chaos, financial challenges, it wasn't a stable living environment. And so when I graduated from high school, what I did is, or actually, before I get to that, when I was 12, I started working. I got a paper route. And pretty much the entire time I was working from starting at age 12 until where I am today. Worked as doing a paper route in my neighborhood. I was a dishwasher at a local restaurant. I was actually a dishwasher at the age of 14 when it was illegal for me to work. The owner of the restaurant paid me under the table below minimum wage. Minimum wage back then was $3.35 an hour. I was getting paid $2 an hour under the table. I'd work 5 hours, he'd give me 10 bucks. And it was a win for him, but it was a win for me because I was making the same amount of money that I did in my paper route, but only having to work 2 days a week rather than seven. Um, and then, afterwards, I eventually went away to college, and that was a big deal for me, to kind of start my life and to kind of get that going. And I wanted to go to school away. In some cases, I wanted to kind of be more independent, start on my own. And I came down here to San Diego, went to UCSD. And in many ways, as I have pursued my life and in my adulthood, I've tried to resolve a lot of the problems that I experienced or witnessed as a child. That's why family stability and especially financial stability have been so important to me. Um, and as I've gotten older and I've learned more about myself, especially now in my 50s, I've been a lot more introspective, and I can look back now on my childhood and the things that I experienced or the things that I learned back then, how it has influenced me as an adult and has shaped me, positively in a lot of cases. How I'm able to see the world or interact in the world around me, how I build relationships. A lot of it influenced by the way that I was brought up and the way, within my family life as a young child. And it's very interesting to me. I mean, that's part of the reason why this podcast, I call it the John Riley Project rather than the John Riley Podcast. Because, like I said, this thing is more than just a podcast. I'm trying to integrate more elements of my business into this. I'm trying to do more blog writing. I kind of have a lot of ideas on things that I want to bake into this. But I also, in the podcast, I talk about a lot of things that are helpful to me as a person as I grow and I develop, even in my 50s. That's why I talk a lot about self esteem and self improvement. And we've talked about journaling and believing in yourself, and, Padre pitcher Chris Paddock and his journey that he's been on in terms of believing in himself. It's all part of what I'm going through as I build this podcast. But when in order for you, I'm sharing this origin story because I think it may give you a greater insight onto why I talk about a lot of the things that I talk about in this podcast. Like, for example, I'm a frequent critic, right, of our local school district, Poway Unified School District. Remember, they passed the $1 billion bond, and the $1 billion bond was this egregious school bond where they borrowed, roughly speaking, $100 million for school upgrades, school infrastructure, and they agreed to pay it back in over the course of 20 years, but paying $1 billion in total. So they borrow 100 million, they pay back $1 billion. I mean, I was a huge critic of that, not just because it was a terrible deal for taxpayers, but because it was so financially irresponsible. And then knowing what I went through as a child with seeing that sort of thing, I knew that that was way over the line. It violated my own moral code. That's why I'm also a very frequent critic of the largesse of spending in federal, state, and even local government, where they just create these deficits. They just put more and more money on the credit card without really blinking an eye. They just kind of take on all that excessive debt and just kick the can down the road. To me, hopefully you understand like the way I was raised. To me, that is a huge, huge moral violation when people are not only just people are doing that, but when your elected leaders, when the so-called, some would say role models in our society are behaving that way, that's why it really rubs me the wrong way. Um, then, another thing that's really important to me is this notion of being a self-starter, right? I did that as a 12-year-old child. I had a paper route, and I told you when I was 14, I was a dishwasher, and I was always hustling because I needed that money as a young child because my parents didn't have a lot of money. So I had to essentially fund my own way. I had to, I was really big into BMX racing back in those days. Well, I, generally speaking, paid for it all. I bought all my bike parts and paid for a lot of my entry fees. I mean, there were some exceptions, but for the most part, I paid my own way, and I was very proud of that. That I was able to do that. I took pride in the work that I had, and I used it to fuel the things that I wanted to pursue. I used the money to pursue my happiness, which again goes back to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'm a big, believer in being a self-starter. That's why I started my own business. That's why I'm an entrepreneur, and that's why I encourage entrepreneurship and gig working. So maybe you can see how that thread or that filament, like in the light bulb, how that all flows. Um, I'm a big believer in self-reliance, right? Not being dependent on others. And so that's why I'm a big believer in independence. That's why, for me, my favorite holiday of the year is always the 4th of July because it's a declaration of independence, right? And then in the preamble is our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Independence is a big deal. That's a big reason why when I started my own business, I wanted to have a sense of independence. And I've often also, to kind of go back on the financial angle, I've told you the story how coming out of the Great Recession, my business greatly suffered. I had to take on a lot of debt. And a lot of businesses that were in my position could easily have declared bankruptcy, but I refused to do that. Um, for, number one, because I didn't want to essentially be dependent on, or essentially, I wanted to take responsibility for the hole that I had to dig. And I climbed out of it. And I'm very proud that I did that. It could have been so easy just to file bankruptcy for my S corporation, but I refused to do it. And I'm so much better off for it. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Um, but I had customers that declared bankruptcy on me and stiffed me with huge bills, and that harmed my business. And I remember I was infuriated by what they did to my little small business. But I learned a lesson from it. I'm not as trustworthy of new customers as I was in the very beginning. I'm always very much with new clients. I want deposits. I want cash up front until I build a relationship and there's trust built. But because I had witnessed how other people were so cavalier with using bankruptcy to escape debt, I refused to do the same thing. And so that also kind of plays into my origin story and the things that I believe in now. Um, for me, I'm a big supporter of obviously family stability. I've talked about my children. Um, really, my son just moved out on Monday, like what, 4 days ago, and he's moving, going to the University of Oklahoma. My children actually moved out in 2019, and to go to college. My daughter had graduated. My son was in college, And I thought we were going to be empty nesters then. But then, due to COVID and other circumstances, my children came home, which was great. But now they've both left the nest again. For me, that's a big success story. For me, it's a success that my wife and I have been able to raise our children in a stable environment with minimal to zero drama, so that my children didn't have to go through some of the things that I went through as a young child. So again, the backstory for me influences the way that I behave as an adult. And that's why I want to kind of give you some more insight on. Um, you know, one of the other values I have is I try to be, to the best of my ability, a strong role model. I'm not perfect. I have a lot of flaws, but I think I follow through on that. I think, I've done a good job as a parent, as a husband. Um, I think some of the things I talk about in this podcast, some of the work that I've done in my community, I think is consistent with that. Um, and the other thing that I've really learned, especially as I become an adult, especially in my 50s, I'm able to see the linkage between my childhood, my middle ages, and now kind of into my 50s. I can see that common thread. I've learned a lot about myself. It's been sort of a self-discovery mission. And, when it comes down to, things like self-esteem, which, we've talked about in this podcast, so much of that is just so important to me. And especially now I've learned so much as an adult about myself. Now I have a greater understanding of the decisions I've made and why I've made those choices. And, I'm a better student of myself. I mean, in many ways, the greatest project that we would ever take on in our own life really is the project of ourselves, is the project of living a valuable life, a flourishing life, essentially a pursuit of happiness, right? For us as individuals to live our own values. I'm trying to do that. Um, the greatest project of my life is the project of me. And I can't be an effective parent or an effective partner to my clients or an effective husband if I'm not first effective to myself or effective with myself. So that's another reason why this podcast is part of what I'll call John Riley Project. So, it's kind of all linked. It's interesting. And so I don't know. I've always been wanting to tell the story of the logo, and I just never found a way to kind of weave it in. I thought I was going to do it in like a little 5-minute Facebook video, but it's Friday. Just felt like sharing, and I just kind of wanted to get to that. And it's when I talk about politics, by the way, I'm a big liberty guy, right? I'm a big, you know, individual rights kind of person. Well, if you want to live a life that embraces entrepreneurship, that embraces you kind of pursuing your own happiness, a life where you have the freedom to make the choices that you want in life, well, you need sort of a political framework that supports capitalism, that supports free markets, that supports individual liberty, right? So again, that's kind of all connected here. And I just thought it was worthy of sharing. So maybe you have an origin story. Um, I hope I hope you do. I hope you have your own version of an origin story because all of us, I would think, have overcome major challenges in our life. We can look back at our childhood, we can look back at our years as a young adult. We learn, we grow, we overcome, but sometimes we keep it to ourselves. But a lot of times, those are the most important stories in the world to share. And for me, doing this podcast, I often comment, I'm kind of putting myself out there, sharing my origin story. very vulnerable, right? Sit here in front of a camera and share it with you. Um, but it feels good to do it. And I'm not in any way, um, what's the right word? Ashamed or um, of my background. Frankly, I'm thankful for it. It's made me a better person. The challenges I've had to overcome have made me what I am today, and I think that's a good thing. So hopefully you have your own origin story. I think if you have a podcast, I think it's important to have an origin story so people can see how you're wired and what's important to you, and again, what sort of makes you tick. So, you have any thoughts or comments? Share them on the screen. Kevin Kennedy commented earlier. Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for the thumbs up on that. Appreciate that. Um, yeah. So, what else? I mean, it's Friday. What do you have planned for the weekend? I'm going to the Padre game tonight. I'm looking forward to that. I haven't seen Charlie Sellers in a long time. We've talked, he was one of my first podcast episodes. I think he might have been like, I don't know, episode number 5 or 6 back in probably September of 2018. Former school board member here at Poway. Good guy. We've been keeping in touch, seen each other a few times since then, but it was nice to get a phone call from Charlie. So we're going to go to the Padre game tonight. Hopefully, the Padres will beat the Mets. I'm looking forward to the game. The Padres won last night. Fernando Tatis had a hell of a game. So hopefully, we see a repeat performance. But I know the Mets have got good pitching going. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, friends. This is a shorter podcast, 30 minutes. I'm going to try to make my podcasts a lot shorter. I think it's good for you. And frankly, it's good for me. So, at any rate, I hope you have a great Friday out there, friends. Be safe, have fun, and we'll see you again Monday at 2 o'clock. See you later, friends. Bye bye.